Earth is a living planet. Life can be found in places where you least expect it. Tiny things can be found in the extremely hot openings of undersea volcanoes and even in hot springs full of acid. Scientists from the University of Colorado have studied tiny organisms that survived for 20 years at the bottom of a dry stream bed in cold Antarctica. When water finally reached them, the organisms sprang to life after only one day, and within a week an entire community had formed. Researchers wonder if these tough life forms could even exist on the cold, dry surface of Mars. In this chapter, you will begin studying life science, a fascinating and sometimes surprising subject. What may be the largest living thing on Earth was discovered in a forest in Oregon. A fungus known as the honey mushroom lives 3 feet underground and covers 10 square kilometers, over 1,000 football fields of the forest floor. Small mushrooms visible above the ground are only a tiny part of this humongous fungus. When scientists study living things, they often take measurements like length and mass. In this section, you will learn about different measurements used by scientists. Measurement and units. A measurement is a value that tells the amount of something. A measurement has a quantity and a unit. For example, 5 centimeters is a measurement because it has a quantity 5 and a unit centimeters. A unit is a fixed amount of something. If you ask someone to walk 5, she would not know how far to go. The units you could use include 5 feet, 5 meters, 5 miles, and 5 kilometers. The centipede in the picture below is 5 centimeters in length. The earthworm is 5 inches in length. Which is a larger unit, centimeters or inches? International System of Measurement, or SI. Units allow people to communicate amounts. To make sure their measurements are accurate, scientists use a set of standard units that have been agreed upon around the world. Table 1.1 shows the units of the International System of Measurement known as the SI system or metric system. Length is in meters, volume is in cubic centimeters or cubic meters, mass is in kilograms, temperature is in Kelvin or Celsius. And area. Length is a measurement of distance. Life scientists measure the length of a living thing along its greatest dimension. Figure 1.2 shows a scale that compares the length of different living things in the appropriate SI units to measure each. What is the length of the fish below? If you measured it to be 10.5 centimeters, you are correct. Area is a measurement of how much surface something has. A coyote occupies a certain area of land called its territory. A coyote's territory is about 16 square kilometers, or km to the power of 2. While this area probably has an irregular shape, if a coyote's territory was a perfect square, you could measure the area as shown below. Length times width. Volume is a measurement of the amount of space something occupies. The volume of a solid object is usually measured in cubic meters or cubic centimeters, cm3. To find the volume of an aquarium, multiply length times width times height as shown below. The volume of a liquid is usually measured in liters or milliliters, ml. 1 milliliter is equal to 1 cubic centimeter. Measuring the volume of a liquid matter is easy. You simply pour it into a marked container such as a measuring cup or graduated cylinder or beaker and read the volume mark. To get the greatest accuracy, there are 2 things to keep in mind. First, read the mark at eye level. Second, you may notice that the surface of the liquid forms a curve rather than a straight line. The curve is called a meniscus. If the meniscus curves downward, liquid water does this. Read the volume at the bottom of the curve as shown in figure 1.3. A few liquids like mercury will form an upward curve. In this case, read the volume mark at the top of the curve. Mass and temperature. Everything around you is made of matter and has mass. Matter is defined as anything that has mass and takes up space. You are matter, and so is air. Mass is the measure of the amount of matter that makes up something. The kilogram, kg, is the basic unit for mass. A typical coyote has a mass of 18 kilograms. There are 1,000 grams in 1 kilogram. The average mass of an earthworm is about 90 grams. This is equal to 0.090 kilograms. Do you see why it's easier to use grams with smaller living things? Most living things can only survive within a certain range of temperatures. For example, coral grows best in waters with a temperature between 21 and 29 degrees Celsius. Temperature is a measure of how hot or cold something is. It has to do with the average motion of the tiny particles, atoms, and molecules that make up matter. As those particles move faster on average, the temperature goes up. As they move slower on average, the temperature goes down. You are most familiar with the Fahrenheit temperature scale, F. Scientists use the Celsius scale, C, and Kelvin, K, to describe temperature. In this book, we will use the Celsius scale. Figure 1.4 shows a comparison between the Fahrenheit and Celsius scale. As you can see, boiling point of water on Celsius is 100 degrees in 212 in Fahrenheit. 1.1. Number 1. Measure the length of the millipede below. Give your answer in meters, centimeters, and millimeters. Which is the best unit to describe its length? Number 2. An acre of land measures 64 meters by 64 meters. What is the area of an acre of land in square meters? Number 3. What is the volume of a fish tank at the right in centimeters cubed? Given that 1 centimeter cube equals 1 milliliter, what is the volume of the tank in liters? Number 4. A marine aquarium is found to contain a salt concentration of 40 parts per thousand. How many grams of salt are in 1 liter of the solution? 1.1. Number 1. Measure the length of the millipede below. Give your answer in meters, centimeters, and millimeters. Which is the best unit to describe its length? Number 2. An acre of land measures 64 meters by 64 meters. What is the area of an acre of land in square meters? Number 3. What is the volume of a fish tank at the right in centimeters cubed? Given that 1 centimeter cube equals 1 milliliter, what is the volume of the tank in liters? Number 4. A marine aquarium is found to contain a salt concentration of 40 parts per thousand. How many grams of salt are in 1 liter of the solution? 1.2. Thinking like a scientist. Science is a process of thinking and learning about the world around us. There are many fields of science, each dealing with a different part of the world. For example, the study of matter is called chemistry, the study of outer space is called astronomy, and the study of life is called biology, and is the subject of this course. How do we go about studying life? In this section, you will learn how to think like a scientist. The scientific method. Worms from mud. Last spring, heavy rains turned the soil in Maria's backyard into mud. Maria noticed that many worms were crawling on the top of the mud that weren't there before, figure 1.6. Did she conclude that the worms were made from the mud? Of course not. It's common scientific knowledge that non-living objects like mud cannot turn into living things like worms. But hundreds of years ago, people actually thought that simple living things like worms and beetles came from non-living things like mud, dirt, and spoiled food. We often take scientific knowledge for granted, even though it is the result of the work of many scientists over many years. The scientific method is a process used by scientists to answer questions like, can a non-living object turn into a living thing? It involves asking questions, developing explanations, and testing those explanations to see if they are correct. You can think of the scientific method as an organized way of asking and answering questions. The explanation that non-living objects can give rise to living things was best based on untested observations. When scientists started using the scientific method in the 1600s, they eventually disproved this idea. Steps to the scientific method. Even though Maria knew that the worms couldn't possibly come from mud, she wondered why they appeared after a heavy rain and weren't even seen when it was dry. She had an idea that the worms came to the surface so they wouldn't drown in the wet mud, and that they preferred to live underground in moist soil. How could she prove her data? Like a scientist, Maria decided to follow the scientific method to try and prove her ideas. While scientists don't always follow the same exact path toward finding answers, it is useful to show the scientific method as a series of steps. The table below shows the steps with Maria's example. 1. Make observations or research something. Maria noticed the worms on the surface of the mud after a heavy rain. 2. Ask a question or state a problem. Why do worms come to the surface after a heavy rain? 3. State a hypothesis. Worms come to the surface after a heavy rain so they won't drown in the wet mud. 4. Test the hypothesis with an experiment. Maria set up 2 tanks. She put 20 worms into each tank. Then she put normal soil in one tank and wet mud into the other. She left both tanks in a window for the day. 5. Draw conclusions based on the test. 17 of the worms in the wet mud came to the surface, while all 20 of the other tanks stayed under the soil. Maria concluded that the worms do not like to stay wet under wet mud. The hypothesis. A hypothesis is a possible explanation that can be tested with an experiment. A hypothesis is based on observation, prior to knowledge, or the results of other experiments. Designing experiments. An experiment is a controlled test to determine if a hypothesis is supported or refuted. An experiment is designed around a system. A system is a group of factors that are related in some way. You choose the system to include the factors you wish to investigate and exclude the factors you think are not important. A variable is a factor that affects how a system works. When designing an experiment, you identify the important variables in the system and change only one variable at a time. You change the variable you want to investigate and keep all the other variables the same. The variable you change is called the experimental variable. The variables you keep the same are called controlled variables. When Maria designed her worm experiment, she created a smaller model of the system she was studying in her backyard. Her model did not include many of the variables found in her backyard, such as plants or other animals. Because of her hypothesis, Maria chose the wetness of her soil as an experimental variable. Her control variables were temperature, light, kind of soil, number of worms, type of worms, and time. Data and conclusions. Scientists do the exact same experiment many times to make sure their results are valid. Each time you do the same experiment, it is called a trial. The results of the experiments are valid only if you get similar results from each trial. Maria conducted 4 trials of the same experiment. Her data is shown in Figure 1.8. It is important to organize your data so that it can be analyzed and presented. You can organize data into tables, charts, and graphs. Maria put her data into a bar graph as shown in Figure 1.9. Which is easier to understand, the table or the bar graph? After analyzing the data, you should be able to state whether your hypothesis is correct, partially correct, or incorrect. When the data does not support the hypothesis, scientists try to find another explanation for what they observed. Sometimes finding out that a hypothesis is wrong is just as helpful as finding out that it's correct. The results help scientists make another hypothesis and design another experiment. Eventually, they get closer to a correct hypothesis. Does Maria support her data support her hypothesis? A lab report is a good way to communicate the results of an experiment to others. It should contain your research question, hypothesis, experimental procedures and data, and your conclusions. If you give an oral report to your class, colorful charts and graphs are a good way to show your data. This is the same way scientists present the results of their experiments to other scientists. Science is an ongoing process. When repeated experiments confirm a hypothesis, scientists usually accept it as valid. When repeated experiments support one or more related hypotheses, a new theory may develop. A theory is an explanation of how a natural process or event is thought to occur. In science, a group of hypotheses become a theory only after repeated experiments and observations with similar results. In science, no theory is accepted as the absolute truth. Theories often change as more experiments are done. The invention of new technologies, such as microscopes, also lead to changes in theories and the development of entirely new theories. You should think of a theory as the best explanation for something that scientists have come up with to date. But if you wait long enough, it may change. As you can see, the scientific method is an ongoing process. The diagram below shows how the process often works. Section Review 1.2. Number 1. Write a hypothesis for the following question. When a plant is placed near a window, why does it lean and grow toward the window? Number 2. A good hypothesis can be tested with an experiment. Which of the following statements is the best hypothesis? Explain your answer. A. There were many students absent from the class today. B. Many students were absent today because the flu is going around. 3. Explain how you would test the hypothesis you chose in the question above. 4. Use the illustration of the experiment below to answer questions A, B, and C. A. What is the experimental variable? B. What is the control variable? C. Write a hypothesis that the experiment could be designed to test. Section 1.3, Graphs. A graph is a visual way to organize data. Scientists sometimes use graphs to see how changing one variable affects another variable. Graphs are also useful for making comparisons between different sets of data. In this section, you will learn about the types of graphs and how to make a line graph. Types of graphs. A graph is a picture that shows how variables are related. Graphs are easier to read than tables of numbers, and so they are often used to analyze data collected during an experiment. Some types of graphs are line, bar, and pie graphs. A line graph is used when the variable causes a second variable to increase or decrease in value. For example, the more gas you put in a car, the farther it travels. Graph A. A bar graph compares categories of information. Graph B. A pie graph is a circular graph that compares categories of information. The data is usually written in percentages. Making a line graph. A line graph shows how a change in one variable influences another variable. The independent variable is the variable you believe might influence another variable. It is often controlled by the experimenter. The dependent variable is the variable that may be influenced by the independent variable. The following example illustrates how to graph variables. As a scuba diver goes deeper underwater, she has to think about pressure. How does an increase in depth affect the pressure? Pressure is measured in units of atmospheres. You live at Earth's surface under a pressure of 1 atmosphere. Figure 110 shows the depth and pressure data. A graph can help you visualize the relationship between the depth of water and pressure. Depth of the independent variable, because we are interested in how it affects pressure. The independent variable always goes on the x-axis of a graph. The dependent variable always goes on the y-axis. In this example, pressure is on the dependent variable. To create a scale for the depth versus pressure graph, you first make a scale. The word scale refers to the size of something. When talking about a graph, scale refers to how each axis is divided up to fit the range of data values. Use the formula below to make a scale for any graph. Data range equals data range divided by the number of boxes on the axis equals the value per box. Suppose your graph has 12 boxes on each axis. Figure 111 shows how you would create a scale for the x-axis. Figure 111 also shows how you would create a scale for the y-axis of the graph for depth and pressure. Plot each point by finding the x value and tracing the graph upward until you get to the right y value. Make a dot for each point. Draw a smooth curve that shows the pattern of the points shown below. Create a title for your graph. Also be sure to label each axis and show units shown above. Do you see the relationship between the variables? The next page explains how to recognize relationships on a graph. Read the next page, then you can see if you can explain what type of relationship is shown in the graph above. Identifying relationships between variables on a graph. When there is a relationship between the variables, the graph shows a clear pattern. The speed and distance variables below show a direct relationship. In a direct relationship, when one variable increases, so does the other. When there is no relationship, the graph looks like a collection of dots. No pattern appears. The number of musical groups a student listed in 1 minute and the last 2 digits of his or her phone number are an example of 2 variables that are not related. Some relationships are inverse. In an inverse relationship, when one variable increases, the other decreases. If you graph how much money you spend against how much you have left, you see an inverse relationship. The more you spend, the less you have. Graphs of inverse relationship always slope down to the right. Describe the relationship in the depth pressure graph on the previous page. Did you know that life can exist even under the extreme pressures at the bottom of the ocean? 1.3 Section Review. Number 1. What is a graph? What are 3 types of graphs? Number 2. Name a situation where you would use a pie graph. Number 3. List the steps to making a graph. Number 4. Suppose you want to make a graph of the average temperature for each month of the year. What is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? Number 5. Make a line graph of the monthly average temperature. Use the data table below. Number 6. For each graph, tell whether it is a direct relationship, inverse relationship, or no relationship.